Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Midtown Scholar bookstore. My name is Alex. I'm the program director here at the Scholar. Thank you for joining us in Harrisburg. We're happy you're here, and we hope you enjoyed tonight's event with Kaveh Akbar and Joseph Earl Thomas. Before we begin, of course, I have some quick housekeeping notes. One, we are early in our event series for 2024, and we've announced many more authors scheduled into the new year. One that I'd like to flag for you all is Thursday, February 15th. We'll be hosting Dr. Keisha Blaine for her new book, Wake Up America, Black Women on the Future of Democracy. Check it out, take an events flyer as you leave, and stay tuned to our social media pages, website, and e-newsletter for event updates. Secondly, tonight we have copies of Martyr available for purchase up at the cafe, as well as Kaveh's other books of poetry. He is sticking around for a book signing after the event. A quick reminder that book sales are the bedrock of sustainability for our free author event series, and each purchase helps support the bookstore, our authors, and the future of our programming. So we encourage you to come away with a book this evening. At this time, it's my honor to introduce our speakers this evening. Our interviewer is Joseph Earl Thomas. Joseph is a writer from Frankfurt whose work has appeared or is forthcoming in VQR, N+1, Gulf Coast, The Offing, and the Kenyon Review. He has an MFA in prose from the University of Notre Dame and is a doctoral candidate in English at the University of Pennsylvania. He's the author of the memoir Sink, as well as the forthcoming novel God Bless You, Otis Spunkmeyer, which is set to release this summer. He's an associate faculty member at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, as well as the director of programs at Blue Stoop in Philadelphia. And a quick special shout out to Joseph for joining us tonight from Philly. If you haven't already, I'd encourage you to check out his memoir Sink, which is available up at the cafe, and Joseph was gracious enough to sign them for us. Of course, our featured author this evening is Kaveh Akbar. Kaveh's poems have appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Paris Review, The Best American Poetry, and elsewhere. He's the author of 2 poetry collections, Pilgrim Bell and Calling a Wolf, in addition to a chapbook, Portrait of the Alcoholic. He is also the editor of the Penguin Book of Spiritual Verse, 110 Poets on the Divine. He lives in Iowa City. Of course, the book we are here for this evening is titled Martyr. It is one of, if not the most highly anticipated novels of the year. I've got to read just one blurb. This one's from Clint Smith, who writes, quote, "I can't remember the last time a book made me feel like this. Martyr is simply extraordinary. The language moves across the page like a symphony, and the story vibrates with an energy that made the book impossible to put down. Kaveh Akbar has written a novel that will stay with me forever. What a story, what a voice, what a gift," end quote. We're honored to welcome Kaveh and Joseph to Harrisburg. So without further ado, please join me in giving them a very warm Harrisburg welcome.
Hi, everybody. How are you all doing on this bright and beautiful early evening? Thank you for coming out. I appreciate it. I was just speaking this morning with a friend about how the opportunity cost of doing stuff like this has never been greater, right? Like you could be learning conversational Esperanto on Duolingo or learning how to julienne an onion or watching any band perform at any venue ever, right, on YouTube, and you're choosing to spend an hour of your most unreplenishable resource, your time, here listening to some guys talk about writing, and that's pretty dope. So thank you so much. It's sincerely a gift, and it's not lost on me, so give yourselves a round of applause. I'm going to read just very, very briefly from the novel, just the very, very opening pages of the novel, and then my friend Joseph and I will talk for a little bit, and then I think that we'll have an opportunity to speak to each other as well. Does that sound like what you had in mind for the evening? Great. Okay. These are truly the opening pages of the novel, so you don't need to know anything. Pretend the Big Bang just happened. Maybe it was that Cyrus had done the wrong drugs in the right order, or the right drugs in the wrong order. But when God finally spoke back to him after 27 years of silence, what Cyrus wanted more than anything else was a do-over, clarification, Lying on his mattress that smelled like piss and Febreze, in his bedroom that smelled like piss and Febreze, Cyrus stared up at the room's single light bulb, willing it to blink again, willing God to confirm that the bulb's flicker had been a divine action and not just the old apartment's trashy wiring. Flash it on and off, Cyrus had been thinking, not for the first time in his life. I always think that the water sip in a reading is like all about control and power. Like just subconsciously, I'm feeling self-conscious in a moment, so I need to make you all watch me be an animal. Sorry. Fucking up the immersion. Okay. Flash it on and off, Cyrus had been thinking, not for the first time in his life. Just a little wink and I'll sell all my shit and buy a camel. I'll start over. All his shit at that moment amounted to a pile of soiled laundry and a stack of books borrowed from various libraries and never returned. Poetry and biographies, To the Lighthouse, My Uncle Napoleon. Never mind all that, though. Cyrus meant it. Why should the Prophet Muhammad get a whole visit from an archangel? Why should Saul get to see the literal light of heaven on the road to Damascus? Of course, it would be easy to establish bedrock faith after such clear-cut revelation. How was it fair to celebrate those guys for faith that wasn't faith at all, that was just obedience to what they plainly observed to be true? And what sense did it make to punish the rest of humanity who had never been privy to such explicit revelation? To make everyone else lurch from crisis to crisis, desperately alone. But then it happened for Cyrus too. Right there in that ratty Indiana bedroom, he asked God to reveal himself, herself, themself, itself, whatever. He asked with all the earnestness at his disposal, which was troves. If every relationship was a series of advances and retreats, Cyrus was almost never the retreater, sharing everything important about himself at a word, a smile, with a shrug as if to say, those are just facts. Why should I be ashamed? He'd lain there on the bare mattress on the hardwood floor, letting his cigarette ash on his bare stomach like some sulky prince, thinking, turn the lights on and off, Lord, and I'll buy a donkey. I promise I'll buy a camel and ride him to Medina, to Gethsemane, wherever. Just flash the lights and I'll figure it out, I promise. He was thinking this, and then something happened. The light bulb flickered, or maybe it got brighter, like a camera's flash going off across the street. Just a fraction of a second like that. And then it was back to normal. Just a regular yellow bulb. Cyrus tried to recount the drugs he'd done that day. The standard bouquet of booze, weed, cigarettes, Klonopin, Adderall, Neurontin, variously throughout the day. He had a couple Percocets left, but he'd been saving them for later that evening. None of what he'd taken was exotic. Nothing that would make him out and out hallucinate. He felt pretty sober, in fact, relative to his baseline. He wondered if it had maybe been the sheer weight of his wanting or his watching that strained his eyes till they saw what they'd wanted to see. He wondered if maybe that was how God worked now in the new world. Tired of interventionist pyrotechnics like burning bushes and locust plagues, maybe God now worked through the tired eyes of drunk Iranians in the American Midwest, through CVS handles of bourbon and little pink pills with G31 written on their side. Cyrus took a pull from the giant plastic Old Crow bottle. The whiskey did, for him, what a bedside table did for normal people. It was always at the head of his mattress, holding what was essential to him in place. It lifted him daily from the same sleep it eventually set him into. Lying there, reflecting on the possible miracle he just experienced, Cyrus asked God to do it again. Confirmation, like typing your password in twice to a web browser. Surely, if the all-knowing creator of the universe had wanted to reveal themselves to Cyrus, there'd be no ambiguity. Cyrus stared at the ceiling light, which in the fog of his cigarette smoke looked like a watery moon, and waited for it to happen again. But it didn't. Whatever sliver of a flicker he had or hadn't perceived didn't come back. And so, lying there in the stuffy haze of relative sobriety, itself a kind of high, amidst the underwear and cans and dried piss and empty orange pill bottles and half-read books held open against the hardwood, breaking their spines to face away, Cyrus had a decision to make.
Thank you, Kaveh. That was great. I'll make sure I don't put this too close to my mouth. All right. There's so many things that I would like to ask you about this wonderful book, actually, that I had a great deal of time enjoying over the past couple weeks.
Thank you for
leading up
spending
to the
that
event.
time with it.
Yeah, naturally. Oh, and listening to your conversation with Tracy on the stacks
Oh,
as well.
yeah.
And then
Tracy
talking
on
to
the
her
Stacks.
about it.
Yo,
Yeah.
everybody listens to the Stacks. Like, do you guys listen to
It's
the
a
Stacks
really
podcast?
good podcast,
I had
yeah.
no idea that like everybody in the world listens to the Stacks. She's so wonderful and she's so lovely. But I had we were just chopping it up. If I had known that
That
it was
everybody's gonna hear
that
it?
like every single person in the world listens to that podcast, I would have dressed up for it or something.
No, it's great. I thought it was a great conversation
Great.
for what it's worth also.
Great.
And I was telling her, interestingly, it's funny the thing you said about tall people and talking to tall people as well. I was like, oh, I remember Kaveh because back in the day, I don't know if you remember this, the Indiana Hullabaloo or something like that it was called.
Yeah.
And I was reading, this is before I was like in an MFA at the
You were
time.
the Notre Dame.
Yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
contingent or whatever we're calling it.
Yeah,
And you came up, we never met before. And I had read something for like 5 minutes and you came up and you were like, you put your hand on my shoulder, you were like, that was incredible. Seriously. And I remember that because it wasn't the kind of, vague aphorism that one is like prompted
No, I
to
don't
do
that.
typically.
I
Exactly,
no,
yeah.
I know bullshit. I don't do that.
No, yeah, and I got
Unless
that, and I got that sense, and I was like,
it
oh,
would be
I remember
cruel
him.
to do that if I didn't mean it.
I mean, right, I also have that sense, but that's not always true. And I remember that, and I was like, oh yeah, I like him because the only time I ever met him was
I don't think I clocked that. Maybe
Yeah,
you told
exactly.
me that at some point, and I didn't.
I don't know, but
Yeah,
but that's maybe good that
Oh,
that
that's
wasn't
amazing.
a
Yeah, well,
memory.
look at you now.
So that's interesting
That's great.
as
Congratulations.
a scene, a set. But I was talking to Tracy, and this was one of the things that came up with her, and something I wanted to know. So a combination of a question, right, which is asking you to talk a little bit about the title and perhaps some different kind of meanings of martyr, because there is one that's closer to like witnessing things, and then the exclamation point as well, right?
Yeah,
On top
yeah,
of it,
yeah.
which seems like a kind of invocation or like demand or
Yeah.
do this.
Yeah, I mean, I can talk about punctuation for a really long time. I came up as a poet, and so this stuff is endlessly fascinating to me, and probably less so to you all. But maybe what I can say is, so the title of the book is Martyr with an exclamation point, right? First of all, I think if I had just called it Martyr without an exclamation point, that would have seemed very dour and self-serious and sort of like martyr, like it would have a very, very different tone, right? And the book is not relentlessly sad. It's not one of those it's not one of those books that is like a vitamin and you take it and it's not necessarily fun. I mean, I hope it's not, I hope it's not one of those books. It's hopefully, there are long extended conversations with Lisa Simpson and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and I mean, there's wackiness afoot, right? And so I wanted to forecast that somehow in the title, even in a book that is about, or the poet Alan Grossman said that writing is about a thing the way a cat is about a house, right? Just sort of patrolling about the house, right? And so insofar as the book is about anything, it is orbiting ideas of death and martyrdom and creating a meaningful death. I will also say that the martyr's death is a very staccato, traditionally thought of as a very sort of staccato burst of a moment, right? Whereas the addict's death, the book orbits addiction and recovery, and the addict's death is a sort of rolling ellipses, right? Especially one in recovery, right? It is a very sort of you win recovery by dying sober, right? And you lose every other outcome, right? The only way to win recovery is dying sober. And so that's much more of a rolling ellipses, right? And the protagonist of the book, who you meet in that very brief excerpt, Cyrus, is someone who is sort of suicidally sad, but he wants to give his life to something larger than himself. He wants to give his life meaning by making his death meaningful, right? And so, he's setting out to study historical martyrs. He's also thinking about, what can I do to give my death meaning, right? Do I light myself on fire in front of a Bank of America? Do I kidnap a conservative Supreme Court justice? What should I do to bring the greatest good to my species, right? And it's not inert either, because he's an Iranian American immigrant, right? And so if he were to kidnap, I need to stop saying this, but if he if he were to kidnap a conservative Supreme Court justice, the news wouldn't say, a leftist American made a principled sacrifice for the good of his species. It would say, Muslim terrorist kidnapped Brett Kavanaugh or whatever. You know what I'm saying? And so there are ways in which his identity loadout inflects the availability of these outcomes too. And so, yeah, I don't know. Does that answer the question at all?
Yeah, no, it really does. And I think the tone thing is big on it too, because I agree, right? It's not a kind of completely sad book, even though, I mean, it kind of fluctuates between a kind of darker interiority and like comedic moments. My favorite one being the kind of Rumi and Swisher Sweets moment with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, right? So there's a lot of those kind of.
There's a scene in which Rumi's smoking a blunt and he's like about to go on stage at a hardcore show. And an important character in the book is talking to him while he's sort of finishing his blunt before he goes on stage.
Yeah, it's very important. Thank you.
It is actually a really important scene in the book. Like, narratively, it's a very important scene in the book.
And this is related then, Kaveh. Can you talk a little bit about the decisions about the form of the book? Because there's these like really specific movements of like front story, right? Like what is happening with Cyrus and crew, and then later on with Orchidea, and then there's the dream sequences that repeat, and then there's poems as well, right? So can you talk about how you decided to kind of mix that up?
Totally. I mean, if you're like, man, I don't like novels, but I liked his poems, like there's like a chapbook's worth of new poems in this book for you too. So they're written in the voice of a character, but so when I was writing this book, I didn't want to assume the hubris that because I had spent my whole life writing poetry, I would immediately know how to write a novel. In fact, I think that poetry is probably closer to, in my own conception, poetry is probably closer to dance or statuary than it is to novel writing, and I think the novel is closer to symphony or film. So I really had to give myself an education, right? So I put myself on this narrative diet of reading 2 novels a week and watching a movie a day, of just sort of like trying to foie gras duck narrative into myself. And or goose, is it foie gras geese or foie gras duck? I don't know, whatever.
They do both now.
Is it both?
I think it's mainly duck.
Listen, I've never had foie gras. I have no idea, but I'll choose a different metaphor. So I put myself on. I mean, I've obviously read novels my whole life, but never in this sort of kleptomaniacal, like, how do I steal? Because like in a poem, I can make interesting characters say gnomic, oracular things to each other, and create the illusion of depth, right? But no one wants to read a nebulous miasma of pretty language, right? I wanted to tell a story, and so I needed to learn how to get people onto planes and put people through doorways and how people pick up the check at a coffee shop. You know what I mean? Like these sorts of things, which nothing in poetry had prepared me for. And so, I just started writing. I'm also someone who just writes a ton, and so it's one of those things where if you knew how many thousands of pages of, I write everything by hand, so if you knew how many like thousands of pages of drafts there were, the novel wouldn't seem remarkable at all. It's like 1,000 monkeys at 1,000 typewriters producing Hamlet eventually. You know what I mean? Like it just is sort of one of those things. Like you just keep writing until it comes out a novel, like at this Borgesian library. That answer your question?
Yeah, it really does. I mean, so it's funny because I feel similar about all of the like opening the door, walking down the stairs, like getting in the car. They get there. I'm like, can we just skip this part? You know what I mean?
But it's hard
Yeah.
to do that stuff without telegraphing it, or
Right.
without being like, okay, I've done the fun part where I get to be a writer, and now I got to tell you what they're doing with their bodies and where they're, you know what I mean?
Yeah, what everybody looks like and all that kind of stuff too. Well, so one of the things that it makes me think about is something else I'm interested in, and it's the kind of work life relationships that characters have here, right? So like the father, Ali's working at this chicken plant, but also makes me think of food in particular, right? The kind of duck goose question. And there's this part on 109 where it's describing what's going on, and this is in the perspective of the father. So there's several different perspectives as well in the novel. And you know, I'm like, oh, they're at work, but it's not really talking about work. It's talking about the desires of the other men at the job. And so I was wondering if you could talk about food a little bit, and about what food means. And I'm thinking specifically, you know, they're describing basically all the different kinds of ethnic food that the men miss now that they are working together at this chicken plant.
So the Cyrus's father in the novel comes to America and works on a chicken farm, like an industrial chicken farm, which and not to put an autobiographical thumb on the scale, but you know, I have family members who worked at similar. My dad worked on industrial poultry farms my entire life, and so on these industrial poultry farms, the first thing to be bred out of industrial birds is the immune system. Right, you breed the immunity out of the birds because it takes a lot of calories to keep an immune system going, and it's a waste of feed. Right, if you can keep the farm biosecure, it's a waste of food, it's a waste of resources. Right, and so it's cheaper to grow birds if they don't have immune systems. And so like to go into the farm. The farm is like biosecure. It's sterile. Like you have to shower before you go on into it, and then wear scrubs while you're in these industrial chicken farms. Or my dad worked on industrial duck farms, but any of these farms in America are sterile, right? Any of these like giant industrial farms, right? Which is nuts to think about. And in the break, and you know, they're almost exclusively staffed by immigrants, and when you go into the break room, you can't have meat because meat has so many germs on it, right? Even cooked meat has so many germs on it, right? So like everyone eats vegetarian in the break room, and you can't bring anything from home. And so the fridge and the freezer would always be filled with these like ready-made vegetarian meals. And so there's a scene in the book where all of these immigrants are sat in this industrial farm break room eating lunch, and they're all talking about their foods from home, but they can never share them with each other, you know? And so there's this like Congolese guy who talks about kwanga, which is kind of like tamales, but nobody knows what tamales or kwanga are. You know, like the guys who know what tamales are don't know what kwanga is, and the guy, you see what I'm saying? And so there's, you know, it's just one of those ways in which, I don't know, I mean, like everyone in this book feels kind of out of place and out of time. You know what I mean? There's a way in which that sort of just being like flicked from one place to another on a map and just like never quite getting your footing where you land is omnipresent for these characters. And again, like food is just one of the 30,000 trillion ways. And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it seems so important. I mean, of course, like when I've read that section, I was thinking about that Hortense Spiller's essay, the eating diaspora, in the beginning of that text. It's like, yeah, that's the immediate thing that came to mind. I was like, oh yeah, the food problem / question all throughout it. This is related to another kind of instance or relation, and that's the countenance of, you know, the real and what you decide to make fictional in this way. And I wasn't thinking about the kind of autobiographical part at first that you just described, but I was thinking about, for example, the Iran Air flight, right, 655, I think it was in like 88, that went down, which is a thing that happens in the book with Roya in particular. I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, so one of the precipitating events of the novel is Iran Air Flight 655 was this civilian airliner moving from Bandar Abbas in 1988 on July 3rd to Dubai. and the USS Vincennes mistook it for a fighter jet and shot it out of the sky, right? For people of a certain age, you hear about this and you say like, oh, the Vincennes incident, which one was that again, right? Like that, and that's about the extent to which it lingers in the American consciousness, right? Whereas in Iran, they put it on postage stamps, right? It has been like minted, literally minted into propaganda, right? 290 people on board were killed, including 66 children. And so there's a way in which the actual lives of the people on board are rendered invisible on both sides, right? You know, America just forgets about it. The imprecision of American justice is just taken as a given, right? You know, it's like the unpleasant but necessary cost of doing business in America, right? And in Iran, the individual lives are utterly effaced, right? Because it has just become this propaganda to stoke anti-Western sentiment, right? After it happens, again, this is July 3rd, 1988, then Vice President George H.W. Bush says, and this is a direct quote, "I don't care what the facts are, I'm not an apologize for America sort of guy," which is pretty chilling, right? I mean, it's pretty chilling. His daughter also has a book club, or his granddaughter, sorry, also has a book club through which she culturally launders a lot of their war crimes, which is neither here nor there. But a chilling fact for me as someone who's now putting a novel into the world, and something that I had to... Anyways, I share this because Cyrus's mother was one of the victims of that, right? She was on the plane, and so Cyrus is haunted by her death, and then very early, I mean, this is like a minor spoiler, it happens like, I don't know, 20, 30 pages into the book. But Cyrus's father dies of a stroke, and so Cyrus is orphaned quickly, and in New Recovery, he's haunted by his parents' deaths, both of them sort of illegible to empire in different ways, right? His father dies anonymously after working on this poultry farm, and his mother dies as one of the 290 people on this flight, you know, and like, to me, you know, this has been an event that I've been obsessed with my whole life. My mom was I was born in Tehran. My mom was in Iran when this happened, and so when people were hanging posters of the 66 children who were killed, she had to have been looking at them and thinking, you know, this child growing inside of me will look like one of these, you know what I mean? Not to be too like woo-woo or epigenetic about it, but I don't know, like I was in there while she was thinking about this, and it's always sort of, it's always interested me. And thinking about if it had happened the other way too, like if Iran had like accidentally shot an American civilian plane out of the sky, like Tehran would be turned to glass. You know what I mean? There would be no Tehran, you know? And so speaking about this, the 290 people on board, if that number was 289 or 291, you know, my brain perceives 290 as a middle large number, right? Like it's more than 5, it's less than 10,000, right? Like it's somewhere in between the two, right? The difference between 290 and 293 is completely illegible to my mind, right? And that more than anything else is the ethical crisis that I feel invested in using my art to resolve, there's no resolution, but to push into a little bit, right? Because I do think that art has the capacity to, you know, everything that happens in this book happens as a result of this one person being on that airplane, right? Cyrus's entire life is indelibly shaped by his mother's death. His father's entire life and death is shaped by this, right? Cyrus's lovers have their lives indelibly shaped by Cyrus's, you see what I'm saying? Like every single, I'm getting goosebumps talking about this. Like every single thing that happens in this book ripples out from that one event, right? And so when you see all of those ripples, and this is just, you know, one of 290, right? The way that the granularity of individual loss amidst a collective grief allows you to get just a tiny little glimmer of what the whole thing might have looked like. You know, like when you read Marilyn Nelson's sonnets for Emmett Till, right? We all know about Emmett Till, right? We all know that story, and we know that there are countless stories that we'll never hear about like his story, right? But when you engage those specific sonnets, right, it returns to the atrocity, its atrociousness. You know what I'm saying? When we look at Rebel Gaza every day and we see the death toll rising in the West Bank, and we see the death toll rising in Congo and Sudan and Ukraine, right? These are totally abstracted. And then you hear a story about an individual person, and that granularity gives texture to the collective grief. You see what I'm saying? And that is what art can do. That is what testimony can do, or witness, whatever you want to call it, right? And so more than anything else, you know, if you walk away from this book being like, I didn't really fuck with the book, but like I did learn about Iran Air Flight 655, like rousing success. You know what I mean? Like truly, I mean it, like rousing success. You know what I mean? Like worth every second of those 5 years that I spent on this book. You know what I'm saying? Because again, like the imprecision of American justice is just taken for granted. You know, it's just like this is, you know, how many times this year has something like this happened? You know what I mean? I don't know, and I wrote a book about it. You know what I mean? And so every time that happens, if you can get like a flicker of a flicker of a flicker of a spark of the awareness that every one of those 17 lives that drone accidentally hit at the wedding had reverberations that go across generations like this, you see what I'm saying? That's what art can do.
Yeah, thank you for that. I also don't know if anybody's gonna walk away being like, I don't fuck with the book, but you know, like I don't. But I remember this.
It's sincerely a weird book.
Well, I mean, there's a bunch of other questions related to that, but I want to get back to the relation that you had brought up, actually, because this is one of the things I was thinking about, the kind of legibility to empire question. And this is on like page 75, I think this comes up directly. And, you know, there's the question, Cyrus is like ruminating about how, you know, his parents and a whole host of other people are like illegible to empire for different reasons. And then I was wondering like, okay, well, does one want to be legible to empire, and what would it mean to be legible? Because there's a certain kind of legibility that like overexposes and you know creates a certain like kind of perpetual motion machine of like human. But you know, there's many ways that we can think about this, especially in the Americas over the past 400 years. But you know, but I really wonder like what would it mean for Cyrus, the character, right? Like it to if those people were legible that he's thinking about to empire.
I mean, that's the whole book, right? I mean, you know, I mean, for instance, Joseph mentioned that there are long dream sequences in the book. I'm aware, like I've been to writer school, like I know you're not supposed to do that. You know what I mean? Like, like I'm aware, you know, like I didn't miss the memo. But I also am aware that, I mean, when I wake up every morning, I ask my spouse if they dreamt. You know, I am fascinated by dreams. And frankly, I think I'm right. Like, I think it's wild that we spend a third of our lives with our brains just staging these productions for us, and we're not supposed to talk about that? You know, like what? That's insane. And so, but like what happens in a dream is utterly illegible to empire. There's no way to monetize it. There's no way to, you know, there's no way to create any sort of value out of what happens in a dream, right? There's no way to, you know, and so it's almost as if we've been trained by the empire that, no, that's not important. Like, get to work. You know what I'm saying? Like, and that sort of thing, but for everything. You know what I mean? Like, it is utterly unimportant to empire what I say when I FaceTime with my nieces. You know what I mean? But it's like the
well,
most...
well, it depends.
Well, I mean,
yeah,
I mean, you know what I mean. Like unless I'm, well, yeah. But there are a few things more important in my life. You know what I mean? There are a few things more important in my life. There are a few things more important in my life than the hours I spend every week walking my dog. Hours and hours and hours. He's never lived a day of his life when I've been in town that I haven't taken him to the dog park, right? It's like, you know, some people do Sudoku or yoga or whatever. I take my dog to the dog park. And like, there's no value in it. I don't do anything while I'm doing, you know what I mean? I like hanging out with him, right? And I don't know, like you know, I have a job, whatever, but, well, you know, but it is those pieces of my life, the dreams and the visions and the hopes and the fear of death and, you know, the things in my life that have no value to empire that feel most sort of architectonic to my person.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I do think like those dream sequences have kind of more value than just like narrative propulsion
Yeah,
or
oh,
kind of other.
100%.
Yeah, I mean, I think they matter a lot.
Yeah,
to
and
the text, yeah.
I mean, I'm being a little bit glib, but I did study. Actually, if you wanna get like real funky about it, like has anyone seen the little known TV show The Sopranos? There's an episode of so The Sopranos famously uses dream sequences, right? And so one of the things that I was doing, because I wanted to use these dream sequences in the book, but I'm aware that an American reader will perceive such sequences as bloat or as unnecessary or as navel-gazing or whatever. And so I wanted to see what successful dream sequences had done in literature, in narrative art, that don't feel bloated, that don't have me looking at my watch, right? And The Sopranos is like one of the very famous examples of that. So as I was studying The Sopranos, there's an episode in which Tony has a dream where he learns in the dream that Big Pussy is a rat, and he's like, "You said what?" A fish tells him, yeah, a fish in the market. Yeah, you know The Sopranos. Yeah, it's like a fish in like on like ice. You know those markets where they have like a fish tells him, and so when Tony wakes, he acts on that, right? And they take spoilers, but they take Big Pussy out to sea and they kill him, right? And it turns out he was in fact a rat, right? And so within the dream, there is important narrative data being revealed, right? And so in this book, there are these extended dream sequences, but in each one, I mean, there are some central mysteries in the book, right? There are some, you know, there's an actual plot and there are sort of central mysteries, et cetera. And in each dream in the book, that plot is being worked on. I mean, those central mysteries are being worked on a little bit, right? And there are recurring images from what happens in the day or songs referenced in, you know, the day that preceded it and stuff like this. And by the end of the book, the dreams are like very, very tied in with the specific narrative that's going on around them. So
Yeah.
shout out David Chase. Throughout The Sopranos.
It's a master class. There's another. Okay, so I'm gonna ask one more question, and maybe we'll go to audience questions as well after that.
Thank you so much for reading it so carefully too. This is
of
fun.
course.
I appreciate it.
No,
It's
I'll
not
be
a
teaching
small
this
gift.
book, and then I'll like be messaging you and be like, well, what do you think about this?
Happy to
Or
zoom
what
in
have
and
you?
talk to your new classroom.
So it'll come up again. Trust me. I want to ask you a little bit about the kind of intimacy and sex relationships in the book, because there's so many different characters who are tied to each other in very specific ways. You know, at a certain point, it stops feeling like even Cyrus is the center of it, right? Because you're like, every perspective you get, there's like, oh, this is, you know, so and so's lover, or this is whatever have you. And I won't say any spoilers for people who haven't read it yet. But I was wondering if you could talk about attenuating that kind of intensity versus kind of like frustration that pretty much every character has with, you know, a lover or intimate in some way.
Attenuating that. What did you say? Intimacy versus
The
frustration.
intimacy and frustration.
Such a gorgeous construction.
It's
like,
on
it just
like
tastes good.
Well, there's like this one line. I think it's on like 176 or something, and it's about, you know, the discernment that a lover can have.
Yeah.
Versus,
Yeah.
and in relation to like literature too, right? Yeah. Like, you know, a lover who's really paying attention can discern a great deal of things in like a gasp.
Oh yeah. Well,
right?
I mean, like anyone who's read Carl Phillips knows how erotic a sentence can be. You know what I mean? Like the sort of like tantric relay of semantic data across a Carl Phillips sentence, where like the direct object is like, you know, 7 or 12 clauses removed from the verb that is doing something to it. You know what I mean? And you're just like, tell me. You know. I mean, I don't think that that's a secret. But one thing that I will say, you know, I was just teaching so everyone knows Achebe, like okay, I'm gonna land this plane, I promise. But everyone knows Achebe, right? The great Nigerian writer of the 20th century, one of the great sort of novelists of the 20th century globally, anywhere. but there's this other writer who I'm really fascinated by, who is one of Achebe's contemporaries named Amos Tutuola, who wrote a book called The Palm Wine Drunkard. I love seeing people nodding in the eye. Fuck yeah. Amos Tutuola he wrote a lot of books, but he wrote a book called The Palm Wine Drunkard. And it's just so messy and weird, and the syntax, even the title of the book, The Palm Wine Drinkard, instead of The Palm Wine Drunkard, the whole book is like that. Like, it's just so weird. And when it came out, everyone was like, we don't sound like we know how to talk. Like, we know how, like, because the syntax is all broken and strange, and the structure is very, very bizarre. And he's like, yeah, no, I know. I'm just telling my Yoruba story. I'm just telling my stories, right? And Achebe is, you could hang one of his sentences next to the Louvre, next to Morrison or Nabokov or whatever, right? He's one of the great sentence writers of our medium, right? But there's almost like this. There are these like phases of, I don't know. It's like mastery of the colonial tongue is here, and then like utter ambivalence to the colonial impulse, right? That's where Tutuola was, right? He was just like, I don't like Achebe was like ironizing the Western gaze using the Western form, right? Like, he took the novel to ironize the Western gaze, looking at Africans. But Tutuola was just like, I don't care, but I'm gonna tell my Yoruba stories, right? And there's a way in which I think about that with regards to the characters in the novel and with regards to queerness, especially, right? Is just like there's one kind of writing queerness where you're just like, this is normal and you have to like accept it, right? And that's dope. Like, we need that sort of writing. But there's also the sort where you just, I don't know, like, whoever you sleep with is who you sleep with, and then the next day you sleep. You know what I mean? Like, and it's not like some tent pole of identity. It's just, right? And I think that the characters in this book tend more towards that Tutuola pole, you see what I'm saying, than the Achebe pole. Not that there needs to be a binary or that it needs to be oppositional in any way, but I'm interested in that ambivalence, right? I'm interested in just, I don't want acceptance, I don't need your acceptance, I'm fine, you know what I mean? Like, I want your ambivalence,
Yeah, there's so many other language questions that come up in there, particularly thinking about, Zora Neale Hurston or like some of Gail Jones' work or something, and the way people talk about the language in those books versus, other things. But I think it's what provides a lot of tension in the sense is that Cyrus is very much invested in a certain kind of like mastery with regards to language at the very least, right? But then in everyone's social lives, it's like, whatever the West is doing, like, we don't really care that much about that. So it creates an interesting scenario.
And I think every character in the book too is interested in the insufficiency of language in different ways.
Yeah.
And that comes up in the minds and in the dialogue of every character. The idea that this medium, which some people are speaking in English, which is not their first language, this medium, the utter insufficiency of it to articulate anything really of value is the way that the emotional precipitants dwarf the medium's ability to hold them, is something that reverberates throughout the novel. You were going to pivot to the audience.
No, it's okay. Yeah, we can pivot. I'm sorry, everyone. Hello. We are going to open it up so that the audience can ask a couple questions. And Alex, I think we'll be going around with. Oh, Alex is right there. Okay, great.
You have a question? Raise your hand. Yeah. Travis, over there.
I do have a very specific question, but before I get to that, given the anticipation of this book that just came out this week, the amazing reviews, congratulations. Any bookstore in the country would be thrilled to have you this weekend. Thank you for being in Harrisburg, and thanks to Midtown. Because that's pretty cool. So, oh, awesome. Cool. So my question is, besides Sopranos, what else were you force-feeding yourself in terms of narrative, books, and movies?
Man, what's your name?
Travis. And actually, I know Dan Barden very well. I used to be in Indianapolis. I know I'm going to talk to you later.
Oh, no way. At the Carvel?
Well, I was in Indy, and I know Susan Neville. And
oh, okay. You're a Butler guy, not a sober guy.
Right. I'm
Sorry,
not.
I don't mean to just be
No,
shouting
that's okay.
okay. Okay, cool. It's nice to meet you. Jesus. Yeah, so I mean, I truly just lowercase c Catholic education. I mean, I would watch Antonioni and Bergman one week, and then Pineapple Express and Disney. Then you know what I mean, like an MGM musicals from the '50s, and you know, like I wanted to know how everyone did it. You know, I would read Nabokov and Morrison one week, and then read pulpy sci-fi paperbacks the next week. I mean, there was no because my education was so kleptomaniacal, I didn't want to draw too heavily from a single influence, because I truly was just utterly mercenary in this. Like I was like, how does everybody do everything? You know, and so I didn't want to draw too heavily from any single. I will say that I wrote the book in weekly pages. The writer Tommy Orange and I still trade pages every Friday. He wrote a book called There There, which is extraordinary, and the sequel/prequel to There There is called Wandering Stars, and it comes out next month, and you should all be very excited because it's even better than There There, which is one of my favorite. I mean, if there is any book published in the last 10 years that will be being taught in 100 that I can like guarantee, it's Tommy Orange's There There. And so Wandering Stars, but I say this to say that just reading Tommy's pages just over and over and over, I've probably read 10 different drafts of Wandering Stars, and he's probably read 10 different drafts of Martyr. And so if there's anyone who's like, and I try to temper it, but I'm yoked to my subjectivity. And so if there's anyone who's louder than anyone else, it's probably Tommy.
Hi, I'm Tara.
Hi, Tara, it's nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. I loved the reading. I love your writing. I appreciate, as another sober person, getting to read about recovery. So I haven't read Martyr yet.
You guys don't, I mean, it's been out since like Tuesday.
I would.
It's not going to expire. Like, you don't need to apologize.
No, like I've been waiting for this book to come out because I'm so excited. But I was wondering if you could talk as a sober writer, just how your process has changed in recovery, because for me, it's definitely changed. And just kind of writing about recovery in a novel versus writing about recovery in poetry.
Yeah,
I know it's like a really big question.
No. It's a beautiful question, and thank you for your recovery. Your sobriety is a gift to the world, and I'm grateful for it. Yeah, I mean, so it's literally like maybe the first thing that comes up if you Google me, that I'm sober. It has like the texture of intimacy when I say it to a crowd, but it's actually like the least intimate thing about me that I could tell you. But yeah, so I've been sober for 10 and a half years. And thank you. I appreciate it. And that is like what I do, like that is my life, like the work that I do in recovery with newcomers and taking meetings into places, and that is what I do with my life. Like, this is how I keep my dog in the expensive kibble from the vet, but like that is what I do with my life, right? And so, as someone who is yoked to my subjectivity, right, like it is inevitably rather going to come out in the work. I will say that early on in recovery, like I'm talking like, when I very, very, very first got sober, and I was just trying to figure out how to fill in my days, because prior to getting sober, there was nothing in my life that wasn't predicated on using, right? I would go to this job to get money, or I would go to this guy's house to get this drug so I could sling it for that drug, so I could sling that drug for, you know what I mean? There was nothing in my life that wasn't that. And so when that was, there's no like extracting that from a life and then just living the rest of your life normal, you know what I mean? Like that is the life, And so I just suddenly had like 16 hours a day to fill before I was allowed to go to sleep, And writing and reading just very, very practically in the most unromantic way possible became a place to put myself. Like very literally, like I would go to the library and pull books off the 811.5 section and sit down with them. And that was like 2 hours where I didn't have to worry about accidentally killing myself. Like I was physically there. Like reading was a place to put my body. You know what I mean? And so were meetings. I don't think it's a lot more mystical than that, It was just a place to be that wasn't anywhere else, and then, as that hook kind of set, right, a lot of those addictive behaviors and obsessions sort of sublimated, right, into that. And, I wake up just as gassed about this stuff as I ever did about the other. You know what I mean? Like, all I want to do is, you can probably tell about how excitable I sound in this moment, like, pontificating about it to a captive audience, that, like, this stuff really gets me going, right? And I think about it a lot, and I've been able to construct a life where I really don't do much except for talk about this stuff, right? I teach in Iowa, and I get to travel around and talk to other people who are passionately curious about this stuff. But yeah, I mean, the only reason that I can do this is because, I do this for a couple hours a week and then spend dozens of hours a week in various and sundry meetings that shall not be named, and work. I have elders in recovery that I talk to. I have newcomers with whom I work with, and not even newcomers anymore, but like people with whom I work. And so because I do that, I can do this.
Question on the stairs to the right.
Hi, I'm Allison.
Allison?
Yes.
Nice to
hi,
meet you.
You as well. I think a lot of your experiences lay the foundation for this story,
Yeah.
but it's not an autobiography. So I was curious if you could explain how, if you did, when you took on this project, distinguishing what you would draw from your own experiences in putting it out to us as the reader in this story, and where you sort of said, no, this is mine. Like, this is my experience, but then this is going to be Cyrus's.
The honest answer is just that I write a lot. Like, I just write a lot, and then the stuff that sounds the best I put in the book. I'm not super. I mean, I could come up with like some like, ooh, this is just for me, but like I'm not super precious about. I mean, again, like, maybe it's because I sit in meetings every day and I'm like, here's what I'm afraid of. Here's how I fucked up in my marriage. It's just not a lot of me that is walled off. I mean, like, I'm not gonna tell you guys. I don't know you guys, but like in my regular group of people with whom I talk, I speak about. I've gotten pretty permeable to the world, right? And so, I will say though that I have a therapist and I have a spouse that I love a lot and I talk to a lot, and I have a recovery support group and that I talk to constantly, and without those things, I don't think I would be as safe to speak about this stuff the way that I do. And I also want to be clear that, like, I mean, I'm being sort of winky about it because I don't know if this is being recorded, but the specific recovery group that I'm a part of, there's an element of anonymity, not because it's like some Freemasony bullshit, but because, if tomorrow I'm like, yeah, what's a fake name of a recovery group? Recovery super duper. Yeah, Recovery R Us helped me get sober, right? And it's so great, and everyone should try Recovery R Us. And then 3 months from now, I relapse, then everyone's gonna be like, oh, I guess Recovery R Us doesn't work, right? And then that's gonna be an impediment to people getting the help that they need, right? And I don't want, I mean, statistically, most of us relapse, you know what I mean? Like, statistically, it's somewhere in my future, you know what I mean? And so I don't ever want to be an impediment to someone and the help that they need, right? And so I act a little smirky and Freemasony in spaces like this, but yeah, I don't know. I write a lot, and the best stuff goes in the book, and then I'm not very precious about preserving the integrity of biographical details. I'm not trying to create a transcript, and this book very much is a work of fiction too. Like, it's, I mean, there are symmetries, but it is very much fiction. Thank you for your question.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Nick.
Hi, Nick.
So this is a question that's more technical about process, if you don't mind.
Love a technical process
Okay.
question.
So I'm old, and I was in tech, and I did a lot of writing, not good, this kind of writing, but on paper, and having to draw arrows and cross stuff out and tape pages together. When I was able to word process things and easily cut and paste,
Yeah.
I was like, I never went back to that. I've often wondered why authors, that I respect prefer to write in hand, do handwritten.
Yeah.
But when you were talking about metaphors about art, you mentioned sculpture and poetry. But I read once that Michelangelo was once asked, well, how do you see what you're going to sculpt? And he said, I don't. I just chip away. I see the marble. I chip away until it reveals itself. Is that something like writing thousands of pages and then going back over them? Is it important to write it back out again?
Yeah, I mean, in that metaphor, you dig up all the marble and then a lot easier to chip away. I mean, I think the actual, not to be like the most obnoxious, pedantic person in the world, but I think that the actual like Michelangelo quote was about the David, and they were asked like, how did you carve the David? And he was like, I just chip. Oh, and they were like, he said, I just chip away everything that's not the David, right? Which is like, yeah, sure, right? But I actually think that that's so lovely and so brilliant. So like if I have a book here, and like making a line, easiest thing, right? Like it's the easiest thing in the world to do with a hand, but to do that in a word processing software would be quite a bit more complicated, right? Okay, stick with me here, Nick. Are you guys familiar with the existence of a video game called Tony Hawk's Pro Skater? Okay, I promise I'm going to answer this question. So when Tony Hawk's Pro Skater came out, everyone was really into it, and all of my friends who were skaters were really into it. But when they went to their competitions, everyone was like utterly dulled to the spectacular tricks that they were doing, because you could just do it by pressing the button or by flipping the joystick or whatever, which is kind of the predictable outcome, right? But the interesting part to me at the time, and I was a kid, but like the interesting part to me at the time was that what they did to combat that was they would do all of those hard tricks that the judges would recognize as difficult, that the casual fans were just like, I don't know, I could do that at home. But they would integrate these like very, very basic things that were like so basic that they didn't go into the video game, but that would impress the crowd, right? Because they weren't in the video game, right? And I feel like writing by hand, and so I think in this metaphor, Microsoft Word is Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, which is to say that anything that you can't do easily in Microsoft Word strikes the reader as like utterly avant-garde, right? It's like, oh, he put a line on the page, and that can be like a lot of sort of visual pyrotechnics signifying nothing, right? But writing like this, I'm not constrained. I will also say that writing on the computer makes everything just look too pretty, right? Like my first drafts are terrible. Like, I'm truly digging marble, you know what I mean? Like I'm truly just in the quarry. Actually, Michelangelo looks out his window in Italy and sees the marble quarries, and so he uses marble, right? I look out my window and I see empire shooting a fire hose of meaningless language to us, right? And so language is my medium, right? It's one-to-one. I'm not saying I'm Michelangelo, but I'm just saying like this is why. But I'm saying this is why the medium, right? The project of empire is to cudgel us into inaction and to dull our critical thinking faculties with this raw overwhelm of meaningless language. You have this infinite scroll on your phone, and you see, a review about a Marvel movie and an ad for blue jeans, and then an autoplay snuff film of state murder of an unarmed civilian, and then an ad for toilet tissue, and then a sports clip. Right? And that is empire training you to treat each of those things as coeval, right? Those are all language, right? I mean, they're all involving language, right? And so it's training you to just keep doing this. It's training you that language is inert, that language doesn't have integrity or history, and so that when you see its violences, you keep scrolling and accept that they are the inevitable imprecision of empire, right? Like that they are the inevitable outcome. What literature does, what good literature does, is slows down your metabolization of language, right? You read a novel more slowly than I'm speaking to you right now, right? You read a novel more slowly than you scroll on your phone, right? That is inherently political. That is inherently returning you to a state of recognition of the materiality of language, right? Which again, writing by hand also, like the English language is the most murderous weapon ever invented, right? It has been used to aid and abet indigenous genocide and chattel slavery and the building and deployment of nuclear weapons and taking us to the precipice of irreversible ecological collapse, possibly crossing it. And all of humanity's greatest hits have been aided and abetted by this technology, like this specific technology, the same technology that I use to tell my nieces that I love them, right? What do you do with that, right? The poet M. Norbessa Phillip, she wrote a book called Zong, says that any English language artist needs to decontaminate the language, right? That's her word, decontaminate the language. The musician Brian Eno, in talking about listening to old blues he's talking about like Dina Washington or Billie Holiday or something, and he says listening to their voice crack on the record is the sound of witnessing emotional events too momentous for the medium assigned to record them. The sound of witnessing emotional events too momentous for the medium assigned to record them. So if the medium of your art is the most insidious technology ever invented by mankind, how do you signify its insufficiency when you want to talk about how much you love your niece or how horrified you are at its violences, right? You have to fracture the medium in some way. You have to show that insufficiency in some way. You have to show the eclipsing momentousness of the experiential or psychological catalyst. Does this make sense, right? And so again, I can do that like this a lot more easily than I can do it within the strictures of a word processing software. Does this make sense?
We have time for 2 more questions, and we got to wrap up.
Hello, I'm Michael, and
Hi,
thank you
Michael.
both for coming out tonight. This is kind of a selfish question, but my
Love
dad
a
was
selfish question.
Yeah, my dad was from Iran actually,
Hey.
so I got to represent that. I'm just curious, did
How come your
Persian
name's
culture?
Michael? Did he just accede to your mother?
Basically,
Yeah.
my middle name's Anush, so that's
Hey,
extremely
wait,
Anush, yeah, Michael Anush. And Mehraz is as Persian as you get. So
that is a juicy.
it's a hard one. Oh, trust me, I know. What my question is, Persian culture is, famous for its poetry, for its literature. I'm curious, in your writing, your poetry, this novel, what role, Persian culture, literature, poetry, if any, had on it that would distinguish it from other Americans may not have recognized.
Yeah. I mean, man, I grew up in America. My first language was Farsi, kind of. I mean, my mom spoke English, but I was born in Tehran, and then we came to America when I was 2.5. And I am someone who loves the Shahnameh and Horma Sabzi, but I also love the Milwaukee Bucks, and I also love, Dickinson, and the specific Venn diagrams of my identities are such that all of these things are laid over each other, right? I mean, if contemporary linguistic thinking, if Chomsky is to be believed, my brain was terraformed for not just for linguistically for Farsi, but that changes all of the algorithms of my thinking, right? Like all of my neural pathways are shaped around a language that I no longer use, right? Which provides a kind of defamiliarist perspective. I mean, I don't know if you feel this way. I would imagine you might, where at a table full of Iranians, I feel like the least Iranian person, and at a table full of Americans, I certainly don't feel particularly American. And so there's a way in which at the table, everyone kind of has their nose pressed up to the mural of the thing, right? But I'm sort of in my own place, and I can kind of see it differently, right? Which is, it can be painful experientially, but creatively, it's great. Creatively, that vantage point, you can draw a lot of, again, you can undo the damage of habituation by standing a bit back.
I was going to say there's a really interesting part in the beginning of the novel where Cyrus's sponsor is kind of making fun of that instance, and he's like, "Yeah, you don't know who you are. Just shut up and do what I say." About the representation problem or whatever.
I think Cyrus's sponsor at one point tells him, I'm not gonna get the quote right. I'm not gonna quote myself right, but but it's something to the effect of you've probably spent more time today, just today, looking at your iPhone than you spent cutting pomegranates in your entire life. But how many pomegranates are in your poems versus how many iPhones? You know what I mean? Like just like that crisis, right?
This will be our last question.
Thank you again, Michael.
Hi, I'm Lena.
Lena?
Yes.
It's nice to meet you.
It's good to meet you too. Thanks for coming out. I have a really particular question because as I'm listening to the conversation, because I haven't read your book yet, that I'm interested about the two kinds of histories that are book ending, no pun intended, kind of the very specific release of your book, right? So the book is predicated on this historical like plane crash being shot out of the sky by U.S. military forces, but your book is also entering at a very particular moment where there's escalating tensions in the Middle East with the Israel-Hamas war, but also with Iran and its proxy groups. So I'm not really sure what my question is. I guess my question would be, what you couldn't have envisioned the history that is being made today 5 years ago, but you wrote the book looking back. And so like, what are you hoping, where does the book fit for you in terms of what kind of work are you hoping it does?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Wittgenstein says that we live forward but understand backwards, and that is the nature of our suffering. I say this to say, I mean, there has not, I mean, you know, I think that there is a way in which, I need to be careful. I was born in 1989, and there has not been a moment of my life where this country has not been bombing or selling bombs to someone who would then bomb a part of the world where people look or pray like me. You know what I mean? There's not been one day of 1 week where that hasn't been happening, right? And so writing my book, I think there's a way in which when people talk about art today, they say now more than ever, or they say, you know, such and such is timely. And I think that a lot of the times what people mean by timely is perishable. You know what I mean? Or like occasional, you know, like, oh, because Gaza's being rubbled right now, this is more relevant. But like Gaza's been being rubbled since 1948, you know, by the same occupiers. You know, like this is not a new thing. You know, like this is, if I had written this book 5 years ago, it would have been as relevant. If I wrote it 5 years from now, it would be as relevant. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, I wrote this book 36 years after Iran Air Flight 655 was shot out of the sky, and it, you know, I don't know that relations between us and Iran have improved much, you know. During COVID, U.S. sanctions on Iran. I'm going to do this. I apologize for getting a little sanctimonious and soapboxy. I promise I'm a pleasant fellow. But during COVID, the death rates in Iran were among the worst in any country in the world because U.S. sanctions on Iran, which were lifted under Obama and then reinstated under 45 when he went back on the nuclear deal, made it so that during the first phase of COVID, Iran couldn't get ventilators. And then once the vaccine was out, Iran couldn't get the vaccine, right? And so I had relatives die. I had, you know, people that I love, people that I talked to who didn't get to leave their house for 18 months. Like literally did not leave their house for 18 months. When I write about things like that, I'm writing from a place of outrage, but I'm not writing from a place of mortal terror, which is where they are, right? I think this is one of the things that BLM actually was really effective at communicating to the American public at large, was that from the vantage point of mortal terror for yourself or your beloveds, moral outrage looks mighty comfortable. You know what I'm saying? Like we should be so lucky as to be merely outraged. You know what I mean? And that is something that I feel right now looking at Gaza. You know, I mean, when I was an undergrad, I was pissing the bed, drunk, and I still was in Students for Justice in Palestine. Like I was still in SJP. It was like the only thing I did. Because, you know, it has, again, like it has been the same and it's wonderful that people are Googling the West Bank now for the first time, and hopefully that will be an enduring thing. But from the vantage point of the synapse between my moral outrage and their mortal terror has to be leveraged into something, right? I can't. If I sit on my hands in the place of moral outrage, right? You see what I'm saying? Art is one channel of that. It does not supplant it entirely. The poet Gwendolyn Brooks wrote a book published a book in 1949 called Annie Allen, for which she won the Pulitzer. And there's a sequence of poems in it called The Children of the Poor, and one of those poems is called First Fight, Then Fiddle, right? Which is to say, first you make safe yourself and your community. I can't quote the poem from memory, but first you make safe yourself and your community, and then you make your art about it, right? And you don't confuse the one for the other significantly, right? This is how art works, and this is how, in my conception, prayer works too, right? Like, I don't get on my knees and pray for, the drones to stop bombing Gaza and then be like, all right, my job is done, any more than I write a poem about the unhoused in my community and say, all right, I did my part, right? You write the poem about the unhoused in your community, and then you go buy socks and Cliff Bars and tampons and you take them to the mission, and that's how poetry works, right? That's how prayer works, right? Teresa of Avila said, God has no hands but ours, right? I can't improve upon that.
Can we give one last round of applause? The new novel is Martyr. Congratulations again to Kaveh. Thank you to Joseph Earl Thomas for coming to moderate. Can we, one last round of applause, can we please? That was incredible. Books. We have books available for purchase up at the cafe. We've got Kaveh's new book as well as his other backlist poetry. We also have Sync by Joseph Earl Thomas. Joseph might be sticking around if you want to get your book personalized, but we have signed copies up there as well. That's it. Thanks for coming out, everyone. Have a good night.
Intentional or path to continue.